Okay, so have you ever felt like, you're putting in the effort, really working hard, but not really getting anywhere?
Yeah.
Like you're just stuck, kind of in a rut, trying to find that thing, the secret to happiness or success or whatever it is you're searching for.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there at some point, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to be taking excerpts from Spencer Johnson's Peaks and Valleys
Oh,
and really try to understand how we can, well, first of all, let's just get through those tough times, but then how we can actually use them to, to
that's
move forward,
yeah.
make them work for us.
What I find so fascinating about Johnson's approach is how he uses a story. It's almost like a parable to really bring these ideas to life. We meet this young man, Michael, who's kind of the embodiment of this feeling of being stuck. He's jumping from job to job, constantly searching for fulfillment, but never quite finding it.
And I bet a lot of people listening can relate to that, right?
Totally, yeah.
That feeling of, like, is this it? Is this all there is?
Exactly.
So he's in this valley, right?
Right.
But then there's this really interesting encounter he has that kind of sets him on a new path. Can you tell us a bit about Anne?
Yeah, so Anne is this incredibly positive person, which is especially striking because it's clear that she's been through some tough times herself. And she attributes her outlook, her positive outlook, to a story she heard. A simple story, but one that really had a profound impact on her.
I have to say, when I first read this part, it really resonated with me because it speaks to the power of stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they can give us that guidance, that clarity when we need it most. So what is this life-changing story that Anne shares?
Okay, so picture this. You have this young man, much like Michael, feeling lost and unhappy, stuck in a valley.
Hmm.
He hears these rumors about a wise old man who lives at the top of a mountain. And this old man, he's rumored to have all the answers, a different perspective. So this young man, he sets off on this really tough climb, determined to find him.
It's such a great metaphor for the effort we put into, changing our circumstances, trying to improve our lives, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And it's rarely easy. There are always obstacles along the way.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, for sure. And Johnson, he doesn't sugarcoat that at all. He actually emphasizes the struggles, like the moments of self-doubt, even injuries that this young man faces on his journey.
Right.
But through it all, you see this incredible determination, this belief that whatever he finds at the top, it's going to be worth the struggle.
He makes that moment when he finally reaches the summit even more powerful. Like, you can just imagine the exhaustion,
Yes.
the relief, the anticipation. And then he meets the old man. But there's a twist. He actually missed the sunset that he was so determined to see.
And that's what's so interesting. It's the old man's reaction that I think is really insightful here. And instead of focusing on what he's missed, the old man, he just gently turns the young man's attention upward and says, the stars were there all the time, weren't they? You just needed to change what you were looking at.
Wow. I mean, that line, it just gives me chills every time I read it.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a powerful illustration of this idea that there's always something positive present. Even when we're so caught up in our own struggles, we just don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
We need that shift in perspective.
It's about finding that hidden good, as Johnson calls it. And for Michael, hearing this story, this simple shift in perspective, it sparks his own journey to understand the connection between these peaks and valleys in his life. It's not about avoiding the valleys altogether, but understanding their purpose.
So it's not about, like, striving for this constant state of bliss, of always being on top of the mountain.
Not at all. Actually, that's one of the key takeaways here.
Yeah.
The central concept is that these peaks and valleys, they're intertwined. They're part of a cycle. So the mistakes we make at the peak, like becoming complacent, overconfident, that's often what leads us right back down into a valley.
Right, because when things are good, we kind of let our guard down, don't we?
Exactly.
And then on the flip side, it's those lessons that we learn, the wisdom we gain while we're down in those valleys, that can lead us to even greater peaks.
That's it. It's all about understanding that cycle and learning how to navigate it effectively.
So how does that actually play out in Michael's life? Because remember, he was stuck in that rut, jumping from job to job, feeling dissatisfied.
Yeah. And in one of these jobs, it's presented as a particularly challenging one. But instead of giving up, he actually uses this crisis, the company's going through a crisis, as an opportunity. He creates this new order system that streamlines their entire process, and he ends up saving the company.
Yep.
And this becomes his first taste of real success.
So he takes this valley, this really difficult situation, and he uses it to fuel his growth, to propel himself forward. That's a pretty powerful example of how these concepts can play out in real life, isn't it?
And it all comes back to perspective, right?
Right.
What we might initially perceive as a setback, a failure, it could actually be the catalyst for our future success.
So we're starting to see how those valleys, as challenging as they can be incredibly valuable.
Mhm.
But how do we actually apply this to our own lives? What's the first step in actually climbing out of a valley and moving towards a peak?
Well, that's where this idea of a sensible vision comes in. Remember how the old man told the young man, you need to change what you're looking at. It's not just about shifting your focus in the moment. It's about actively creating a vision for yourself, a clear picture of what you want your future to look like.
So it's not just about, like, saying, I want to be happy or I want to be successful.
Right.
It needs to be more concrete than that.
Exactly. It needs to be sensible, as the old man says. And that means it has to be realistic, something you can actually achieve, but also something that's deeply personal and truly motivating for you.
So thinking back to Michael, how does he actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
Because, I think a lot of us struggle with setting goals or creating visions that we actually believe in and stick to.
Well, the book gives a really great example of this. So remember, Michael, he had that initial taste of success, but then he kind of got a little complacent,
Mm-hmm.
which ultimately led him back down into a valley.
Right.
And it's during this time in the valley that he revisits the old man's advice about this sensible vision. He realizes that his previous vision, it was too focused on external validation, like getting promotions, higher salary, things that were ultimately outside of his control.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though.
No, totally.
We tie our happiness and our success to these external things, but they're often fleeting or dependent on other people.
Yeah, for sure. So this time, Michael, he takes a different approach. He really digs deeper and asks himself, what do I actually value? What kind of work would truly make me feel fulfilled, regardless of the external rewards? And then he starts to really visualize himself doing this work, experiencing the day-to-day reality of it.
So it's not just about picturing the end goal, but really embodying that vision, like feeling it on a gut level.
Exactly. He engages all his senses, he pictures
Right.
the environment, he imagines the conversations he'd be having, the projects he'd be working on, even the feeling of accomplishment that this work would bring him. And this time, his vision is rooted in something much deeper, something that's more meaningful, something that aligns with his values.
This is so key for our listeners, right?
Mm.
Because it's not enough to just set any goal. It has to be something that resonates with you at your core. Something that you can draw on, that you can find strength and motivation from, especially when you're going through those tough times.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, it's not like once you have this vision, everything's just going to be smooth sailing. The peaks and valleys, they're a part of life. They're going to keep coming.
Right.
And Johnson, he introduces another concept here that I think is really interesting. Plateaus.
Ah, yes.
Mm.
Plateaus. I was wondering when those would come into play.
Yeah.
So we're not just talking about these constant ups and downs, but these periods of kind of in between.
Exactly. Plateaus, they're those stretches where things might feel a little bit stagnant. You're not really soaring to new heights, but you're not necessarily down in a valley either.
It's like that feeling of like, okay, is this it? Am I just stuck here now?
Hmm.
It's not necessarily bad, but it's not like super exciting either.
Yeah. And I think it's easy to get really restless during those times or impatient, like we should always be moving forward, always progressing. But Johnson, he offers a really different perspective. He suggests that plateaus, they're not something to be feared or rushed through. They're actually a really important part of the cycle.
Okay.
It's a time for rest, a time for reflection, a time to really integrate everything you've learned.
It's like catching your breath after a climb.
Exactly.
Or like maybe gathering your strengths before the next one.
Yeah. It's a chance to really consolidate those lessons that you learned from the previous peak and valley, to refine that sensible vision, and just prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for that next stage.
It's interesting. We talk a lot about self-care and reflection, but it's usually in the context of like recovering from a difficult experience, like, oh, you're feeling burned out, you need to take some time for yourself.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that incorporating these periods of reflection into our lives, even when things are going well, it can actually help us navigate future challenges more effectively.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges, remember how the book started with Anne finding comfort and guidance through a story?
Mm-hmm.
Well, later in the book, Johnson, he introduces a really significant loss into Michael's journey. The old man actually passes away.
Yeah, I was wondering when we circle back to that, it's a good reminder that, even when we feel like we're starting to figure things out, life
Right.
life happens. And so How does Michael deal with this loss, especially given how impactful his relationship with the old man was?
Well, it's a really profound moment in the story because it forces Michael and us as readers to confront the reality that even with, even with all the wisdom and guidance in the world, life is always going to throw us curveballs.
Yeah.
It's not always going to go according to plan. And I think, it makes us think about how we can't avoid grief. We can't avoid loss. They're just part of life.
Mm-hmm.
But we can learn to navigate them, to see them as part of this natural ebb and flow of being alive.
Right. And it's like, it's not about, not experiencing those lows, but
Yeah.
how can we approach them? How can we move through them in a way that allows us to keep growing, to keep moving forward?
And that's where the peaks and valleys philosophy really comes into play, I think, because it provides a framework for understanding and navigating these inevitable ups and downs.
So how does Michael ultimately cope with the old man's death then?
Yeah.
Because, he's lost his mentor, his guide.
Well, he goes through a process, as we all do when we experience loss. But what's interesting is that he starts to process it through this lens of peaks and valleys.
Okay.
And he realizes that just as the old man taught him to find the hidden good in difficult times, there's also a hidden good in loss.
What do you mean?
Well, he realizes that this loss, as painful as it is, has also brought about a deeper appreciation for life. It's given him this renewed sense of purpose. He wants to honor the old man's memory by truly living out these lessons, by sharing this wisdom with others.
It's like that saying, the teacher appears when the student is ready.
Exactly. And, that's something I really want to emphasize for our listeners. We've been exploring these concepts from peaks and valleys, but the real power, it comes from internalizing these ideas, from finding what resonates with you and applying it to your own unique experiences.
It's like we've been given a set of tools, right?
Mhm.
But it's up to us to figure out how to use those tools to build something meaningful in our own lives.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful tools we have, I think, is this idea of sharing the wisdom, of passing it on.
Yeah, and we see that throughout the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
With Anne sharing that story that had such a profound impact on her. And then, of course, with Michael feeling this urge to do the same.
And that brings us back to you listening to this deep dive. Maybe something we've talked about today resonated with you, sparked an idea, or gave you a new perspective on something you're going through. And if that's the case, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone.
Right. Tell a friend, a family member, a colleague, whoever you think might benefit from hearing it.
Because that's how these ideas spread. That's how we help each other navigate the peaks and valleys of life.
So to wrap things up today, we want to leave you with one final thought, a bit of a challenge. We've talked a lot about navigating the valleys, right? How to find that hidden good and use it to propel ourselves forward. But here's the question. How can you manage your peaks, those times when things are good, in a way that creates more sustained happiness, more fulfilling plateaus, and maybe even, hopefully, less dramatic falls into those valleys?
That's a really good question.
What can you do today to, cultivate humility, gratitude, a sense of perspective, especially when things are good, so that you can really savor them, but also lay the groundwork for more balanced, more resilient life? Because ultimately, I think that's what peaks and valleys is all about. It's not just about surviving the ups and downs. It's about learning to thrive within them.